Hey guys, Deb Acker here. So I wanted to do a video today I know there's a lot of fear going around. I know obviously if you're on social media or reading or watching the news, right, it can be really easy to get soaked in the fear, so to speak. And I wanted to do a video of how to actually lessen the fear, right? And first of all, I want to thank all the healthcare workers and everyone that are putting their lives on the line, and also who are out there helping us so that we can sustain and obviously be able to stay safe in our homes, right? And also with this, my heart goes out to you. If you've been directly impacted by this in any way, my heart goes out to you. And even if you're being directly impacted by this by feeling so much fear, my heart also goes out to you. And so really, what I wanted to really talk about today, right, is how do we actually lessen this, right? And really, what is the purpose of fear? So for many of us, the purpose of fear helps us to feel safe, right? It helps us to feel in control. It helps us to fit in or feel like we're part of community. So first of all, notice if that is true for you, right? And with this, though, if you're noticing that this is true for you, which it is, right? It's just the ways that we're learning how to cope in our lives, right? Recognizing the long-term impact of sitting in fear over and over and over again, right? And so, we may or may not be aware of this, right? But like if you feel fear in your body, right, it doesn't feel good, right? So first and foremost, being aware of that and noticing that. So obviously, it doesn't feel good even feeling it for a minute or 2 minutes, right? And if we're sitting in it long term, right? If we're sitting in it over days, hours, days, weeks, months, right? The long-term impact of it is that it can cause disease, right? And so most of us are thinking, okay, well, we're sitting in this and trying to actually, stop the fear, right? We're trying to take control of the fear. And we're sitting in this out of a fear of, getting, I believe in consciousness, so I'm just going to call it CV, right? We're sitting in fear out of a fear of getting CV, right? And out of fear really of what if we got it, what that means for us, right? And what that means for our health. But having the awareness and being aware that even if you don't get CV, if you're sitting in fear over, people are saying, weeks. It's going to be longer than that, right? And so we need ways in our life to be able to cope with the fear, right? How do we actually cope with it? How do we actually manage it, right? So that we can actually help ourselves in the long run so that we're not sitting in this no matter what's happening in our environment, right? And so it's so important to recognize that. And it's also so important to recognize in sitting in it. So here's the thing. 4 years ago for many of us, and this is not meant to be a political conversation, but 4 years ago for many of us, there was a lot of fear that came into the field. And what did most people do with that fear, right? In that political environment, most people, did some form of escape. And so many times that's how we're used to dealing with fear, right? Dealing with escape. Right. So it's one of those things where, we'll go and watch. Well, right now it's Netflix and chilling. Right. Which there's nothing wrong with that. But recognizing that if we're going to sit in that fear, right, so to speak, if we're going to be sitting in that's actually not serving us. Right. And so here's the thing. If we're going to sit in fear, right, recognizing that, and we're not actually doing things that are constructive to feel that fear and to actually to clear that fear, guess what? The message is just going to keep getting louder. And that's why I brought up 4 years ago, right? Because there was a lot of fear happening 4 years ago. And a lot of us just did forms of escape to try to not feel that. Right? And now the message got louder, right? And the message is less avoidable, right? And so it's so important that we're finding constructive ways to actually feel our fear and to move through the fear. And so when I asked inside, what is the true cause of fear, right? What is the root cause of fear? The message that I got, what I heard, was it's a lack of connection to our source, right? So we think that the fear right now is being brought up or being caused by coronavirus, right? By CV. The fear that's happening right now is actually due to a lack of connection with our source, right? Or an incomplete connection to our source, right? And so it's so important that if you are feeling fear and you are sitting in fear regularly, right, over and over and over again, if you are doing that, right, recognizing that in the long run, in the long term, that can cause disease in your body, right? Recognizing it doesn't even feel good in the short term, recognizing that it's got a message for you, and that if you don't get the message, unfortunately, how it just works is the message is just going to get louder, right? And so again, finding constructive ways, which is what I'm going to move on to next, but finding constructive ways of how do I actually not just sit in the fear and soak in it and take a fear bath, so to speak, right? But actually being willing to, how do I actually find ways to constructively feel this so that I can actually feel good no matter what's occurring in my outer world. And so how we do this, so like I said, the cause and really the root of fear is our lack of our connection to source, right? And so being willing to actually start to look at, okay, if I'm feeling so much fear right now, it's not because of what's going on in the world. It's a little bit of that, right? But it's really being brought up because of something deeper rooted, right? And so starting to ask yourself a question, if you're feeling that much fear coming in, right? And you're sitting in this and you're so scared all the time, asking yourself the question, where do I feel abandoned in my life by God, by source, by universe, however you define it, right? I'm not here to have a religious conversation, right? But however you define your source or lack of, however you previously defined it, or maybe you came in and you didn't have a strong connection, being willing to start to actually look at and say to yourself, where did I in my life, in my childhood, feel abandoned by source, right? And a lot of times we make our parents our source, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to mean that it's source or it's God, right? But we make our parents our source. So looking at, okay, if you were like, I didn't have a strong connection to God, source, universe, again, however you define it in your life, being willing to actually look at and go, okay, so where did I feel abandoned by a parent, right? And these can happen in small ways where we feel like a parent doesn't pay attention to us, or they're not there for us, they're not around for us. Or it can be in a big way, like when I was younger and I lost my mom when I was 17, that was a place where I felt abandoned in my life, right? Abandoned by source, in my own way, abandoned by her, right? And so being willing to look at that and start to go and start to talk to your inner child. So for many of us, this work is new, right? And really, really becoming aware of, okay, so we all have an inner child, a little kid that lives inside of us. And that little kid has a voice, right? And that little kid has a voice about everything that's happening in your life, right? Some of it's good, some of it's not so good, right? And starting, if you aren't already, starting to build that connection with that inner child. And in that moment of abandoning that happened, whether it was by God or it was by your parents who you made your God in those moments, understandably, right? Being willing to look at that and go, okay, how did my inner child feel about that abandonment that happened, right? And, your inner child might say, I didn't like it, right? Or, again, you let me down, right? So in some way you might feel let down by source, by God, by universe, again, however you define it, right? And just starting to say this stuff out loud, right? So just starting to say out loud, you let me down, God, source, universe, you let me down. And starting to own that and see it leaving you, and it's not about cementing it in or circling in it or anything, right? But actually starting to see it leaving you, right? And honoring, okay, these are the places in my life where I felt let down. And again, let down by God or let down by your parents who you made your God when you were a kid, right? And then starting to connect to the little kid that was in that environment that maybe didn't like it, right? And then start to see that actually leaving your body, right? Start to see it actually saying it out loud. You're starting to own your experience, right? Because we feel abandoned in these moments because our connection to God, to source, needs to be stronger, right? That is what's going to clear out the fear. That is what's going to shift the fear. And also with this, being willing to actually feel our feelings, right? So it's interesting, right? Because it's like, feel the fear to feel less fear, right? But the point of this is that actually the fear is coming up for a reason. Starting to recognize, what is that message of that fear, right? What does that fear have to show me? What is it here for, really, right? And being willing to be honest with yourself. And even if you could take 1 or 2 minutes a day to start to actually feel the fear, right? To actually get present, and just even to say to yourself, what am I scared of right now? In this moment, what am I scared of, right? And if you can say that and actually say out loud, I'm scared that I'm gonna die, or I'm scared that I'm, gonna get it, or whatever is true for you in that moment, again, seeing it leave your body, right? So again, being aware and actually seeing it leave your body, not cementing the story in, but actually being willing to see it leaving your body, that's going to start to shift your experience. And what happens is that the thing that we are avoiding is what keeps us out of present moment, right? So the thing that when we're avoiding the fear and we're trying to Netflix and chill, I use that a lot. It is a natural thing to also want to do that. And I'm not discouraging enjoyment as well during these times. That's also a coping tool. But also, if we can actually take time, again, that 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, to be present in this moment, right? To have some consciousness and say, okay, what am I scared of right now? I'm scared of, and fill in the blank, and then just say that out loud, seeing it leave your body. That will start to shift your experience, right? You will start to ground into your body and ground into the lower part of your body. And with this, you're going to feel less abandoned by yourself, right? Because when we avoid our feelings, when we don't acknowledge our feelings, that is where abandonment happens, right? And so when we feel that, when that happens, that's where abandonment happens, right? And that is also, the more we feel that we have our own back, the less lonely we're going to feel during these times, no matter how much connection we have or we don't have, right? And also with this, the more that we're going to feel less fear, right? Because we're acknowledging it, we're starting to own it, and we're starting to feel like, okay, I'm not abandoning myself by pretending there's a feeling that's there that's not really there, right? Or vice versa. However I said that. So it's so important to start to be aware of this, right? And to start to really notice, okay, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to start to acknowledge my experience. Again, take 1 to 2 minutes a day and start to see within a week, you will have a completely shifted experience. Because again, fear is the root. The root of fear is our lack of connection to our source. When we can start to own our fear, and then we can start to acknowledge, okay, the parts of our lives where we felt abandoned by source in some way, just literally by talking to our inner child, the little boy or little girl that lives inside of us, and starting to acknowledge that and say, how did that make you feel when, for me, my mom died, right? It sucked, right? And I felt abandoned by God, right? And start to say that out loud, again, seeing it leave your body. That's when we start to return to ourselves. We start to return to our truth. We start to know that we have everything we need to get through this time, right? To be able to honor this time, get through this time, and actually feel more centered in ourselves. That's when everything changes. So I invite you guys, as you're watching, so if you have questions, go ahead and you can type in. And while if anyone's typing in their questions, and if you're listening to the replay of this, you can also type in your questions or anything you'd like to see me do a video on regarding what's going on in the world right now. So feel free to type that in. And I will leave you with this is such a pivotal time in our lives. And again, us being willing to really own our experience is going to shift this and start to create a new earth, a new world. There's so much amazing stuff that's going to open as a result of this. And if we're willing to actually be in our true experience and not find ways to avoid, and I get that there might be some balance there, right? But find some ways to actually really face what's going on in our lives. Things are going to start to shift and shift for the better. So thanks so much for watching. Again, any questions, posts, I'll be happy to comment on them as well. And I look forward to seeing you